That old phrase, "it takes a village to raise a child," could rightly be applied here, as it is most certainly has taken all of you to raise this festival from its infancy to a young adult of 20 years. This evening's host is David Newhouse, Chair of the Department of Indigenous Studies at Trent University. So what better person than David Newhouse could there possibly be to host the two authors this evening, Mark Abley and Richard Wagamese. Welcome, David.
Okay, thanks, Stephanie. So I'll start again. So thank you very much for coming. And thank you, Stephanie, for introducing me. And thank you to the sponsors of the festival for opening this event, right, with a discussion about reconciliation. We have two people who are going to read from their work and going to talk about reconciliation tonight. Mark Abley, who has written Conversations with a Dead Man, The Legacy of Duncan Campbell Scott, in which he explores the complex character of a public servant. One would never think the public servants have complex characters. I was a public servant for a decade. So. But tonight we have both of them here for a bit. They're going to read from their work, and they're going to offer some commentary on one of the most important national projects that I think this country has ever undertaken, the reconciliation project between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples. What does reconciliation look like? After we find out the truth, what do we do? And so that's the question that we want to talk about after they've read and offered their views and thoughts upon this question as well. So after the truth, right, supposedly we're to be reconciled, and so what does reconciliation look like? Because that's a question that I think we need to begin to talk about as well. So I'd like to at least move now then to Mark, who's going to read first, and then Richard will read second, and then we'll have a discussion with all of us after that. Okay, so.
Thank you, David. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Just a point of not exactly correction. It's true I was born in England, but having lived in Sault Ste. Marie when I was 3 and 4 years old, and then Lethbridge and Saskatoon as a child after that, I think of myself as Canadian. It's great to be at the Lakefield Festival. It's great to be somewhere where writers and writing are so accepted as part of the community. And for me, it's very moving to be here in a place where Margaret Lawrence was at home. My first appearance of my prose in book form was in a book in the mid-'80s when I was a young writer called Canada and the Nuclear Arms Race. And I'd written an inconsequential essay that I don't look back on with any great pride, except for the fact that Margaret Lawrence wrote the foreword to that book. And so that really meant a lot to me, and to see her house this afternoon, I was delighted to do that. I also want to acknowledge, and I think it's very important to acknowledge, that we are here on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. I came to writing about Duncan Campbell Scott, like many mainstream Canadians, I think out of a sense of general shame and general ignorance. General shame that my country should have perpetrated the residential school system for more than a century, and ignorance as to why this had happened, and how this had happened, and how people who didn't seem to behave in brutal, inhuman ways in other parts of their lives were responsible for a system which was brutal and inhuman. And it was in trying to answer that question to my own satisfaction that I realized the figure of Duncan Campbell Scott would be a good way of looking at this. Scott was born in 1862, he died in 1947, so a very long life. And I knew of him growing up as a poet. He was a staple in the Canadian poetry courses I took at university. I didn't realize that for more than 50 years he worked in the Department of Indian Affairs. He was the chief accountant, so he knew where the money went and how little of it went. Then he became the supervisor of Indian schools, and then he became deputy minister. And for nearly 20 years he was deputy superintendent general, was the official title. Really running the department, because the politicians mostly left Indian Affairs to its own devices. And it was in that capacity as Deputy Superintendent General that he told the House of Commons Committee in 1920 that the aim of the department was to get rid of the Indian problem once and for all. And yet, he also wrote some of his best poems about Aboriginal people. And in other ways, as I discovered, he was a great promoter of the arts. He was a great, he loved nature, he loved cats, he was a loyal friend, he was a good father, he was the kind of person that many of us aspire to be. But he was also responsible for running Indian Affairs, and in particular the residential schools. And it took me a while, after I'd done a good deal of research about Scott, to figure out how I was going to write a book, because books that are about historical figures, semi-forgotten historical figures to the mainstream, don't tend to sell a great number of copies. There are only two groups who remember Duncan Campbell Scott well, who know of him. One are the poets and the graduate students and the professors of literature, and the other are Aboriginal elders and writers and activists. But to most people in the mainstream, Scott is largely forgotten. And I thought, how can I write something that will make him and the issues that come to life through looking at his work, how can I make this something that people will want to read? And I've been going around for a while asking him questions, mostly along the lines of, why did you and how could you? And finally I thought that instead of writing a conventional biography, what I should do was bring him into my living room and confront him. And that's why the book, Conversations with a Dead Man, has that title, and that's why it has the particular form it does. On the first page, I'm sitting in my living room in suburban Montreal, and my cat jumps off my lap and hisses and runs off to the back door, and I look up and there's the ghost standing in my living room. And he's come back because he's heard in the afterlife, which I leave unspecified as to where in the afterlife, he's heard that his reputation is ruined and his name is mud. And it's, in fact, Canada's History magazine several years ago asked a panel of experts to name the worst Canadians of all time. And along with the guy who founded the Canadian Nazi Party and the Japanese Canadian who went back to Japan and tortured Allied prisoners in World War II, along with people like that, Duncan Campbell Scott was one of the people named. So the fiction, if you like, of the book is that in the afterlife, Scott has heard this, and he gets permission from whoever runs the afterlife to come back and ask a Canadian poet and journalist to clear his name. And in the course of the book, I outline at the start of the remaining chapters, I spend several pages going through the research, and then I get to the actual conversations, or sometimes confrontations, with the ghost of Scott. And so my hope is that this is a more lively way to present the issues. The tone changes, it's not all a relentless kind of tone. And as you'll hear from the excerpt I'm about to read, it can initially be a little discursive. It doesn't work, I think, in a book of nonfiction. It doesn't work to have a remorselessness. Eventually I arrive at saying hard things and necessary things, but sometimes I take a bit of a detour to get there. So I'm going to read now from the third chapter of the book. This is the third visit of Duncan Campbell Scott, and it's very much in the sense of in sense of what David raised about truth and reconciliation. This is still telling Scott the truth, and thereby, I hope, making the reader imagine the truth. The authentic feel of Canada, Scott repeated. Sometimes in the wilderness, it was as if my soul could expand. A canoe brings enormous freedom, Mind you, the wilderness can also induce fear. I don't know what your own beliefs are, Mr. Abley, and I wonder if you might quibble at my use of the word soul. But I can tell you that Lauren Harris and Alex Jackson were among the artists who agreed with me. Daily life in a city acts as a constraint on the imagination. Do you not find this? At times, sure. But I can also be excited, I said, by the sights and noises of city life. If you could walk today through downtown Montreal or Vancouver or Toronto, or even Ottawa, you'd be amazed at the mixture of foods, clothes, languages. Scott frowned. Alluring, perhaps. A touch of the wider world, yet also somewhat incoherent, surely. It's been more than 40 years, I told him, since the Canadian government gave a special preference to British immigrants, to white immigrants from anywhere, in fact. The colour of urban Canada is not what it used to be, except in the corridors of power. I see. Even in my day, a good deal of mixing took place in the larger cities. Winnipeg, for instance, the gateway to the West, they like to call it. Icelanders and Jews, Ukrainians and French. Some Germans lived in the vicinity too, not to mention the proud Scots who founded the place. The triumph of Canada is that once they'd settled here and made this country their own, all these people were loyal to the crown. They became Canadians. They assimilated. Made this country their own. I wondered whether to challenge him on the point. Instead, I took an oblique approach. You know, I was in Winnipeg a few weeks ago, I said, leaning forward and watching him closely. An interesting place, I always thought, despite its failures of beauty. I wasn't sure I'd heard him right. Beauty or duty? Its somewhat discordant appearance, I mean. When a Scottish journalist named Bob Edwards got off the train there and looked around, he said, "So this is Winnipeg. I can tell it's not Paris." Not that Winnipeg was any uglier than a few other cities I could name. Tell me, has the country finally begun to appreciate the virtues of good architecture? I was puzzled. It seemed as though on his third visit, Scott wanted to chat, wanted to digress. We have some beautiful new buildings and some others that are very striking, for better or worse. You'd be astonished if you could see what's happened to the Royal Ontario Museum and the Ontario College of Art. But overall, let's say civic beauty is still a work in progress. I understand. Scott paused. I could have sworn he sighed. So what did you want to tell me about Winnipeg? I was there for a festival, I said. It occupied most of my evenings, but the days were free. And one morning, the friend I was staying with, she's a social worker, took me to the head office of Cancer Care Manitoba. They have a lecture theatre where experts come and give talks to doctors and nurses and medical students. My friend kind of sneaked me in. Sneaked me in, he repeated. It must have been a novel turn of phrase for him. Yes, but that day the talk wasn't given by any of the usual experts, not anyone directly involved in medicine. It was given by a judge, Murray Sinclair. A good Scottish name, Scott said. Absolutely. As well as serving on the bench, he teaches law at the University of Manitoba. He's widely respected across the country. I imagine so. He has another name too, I said. Misanegishik, meaning the one who speaks of pictures in the sky. My Ojibwe pronunciation isn't what it should be. Scott was silent. Of course, it's a good idea for medical professionals there to be familiar with Aboriginal issues because Winnipeg has more Indigenous residents than any other place in the country. And Murray Sinclair is not only a judge, a professor, and an Ojibwe elder, he's also the head of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. Scott remained silent. I forged ahead. That commission is at work as we speak. Its mandate is to find out everything it can about what really happened in the Indian residential schools and to see if there can be some kind of reconciliation at the end of all the truth-telling. The Commission has its headquarters in Winnipeg, but it's been holding sessions in a variety of places to listen to the testimony of survivors. I've read the report it released in 2012. I expect its final report will be even longer and more detailed. Scott had recovered his voice, though now it had a tense edge again. And why should there be a commission at this point in history, many years after the last school was closed? Well, as part of the compensation package the federal government and the Assembly of First Nations agreed to, the deal was not only that the survivors would receive some money, it's also that a commission would be set up, giving them a chance to speak, to share their story. And besides, it's important for Canada as a whole that these testimonies should be on the public record, should be heard, should be preserved, so that nothing like this could happen again. Scott stirred uneasily. And what did the Honourable Mr. Sinclair have to say in the lecture you attended? He spoke about the different types of negative impact the schools had on the children who were sent there. Being victimized directly is the most obvious one, but there are others too. Judge Sinclair explained the fear of disclosure. Children were threatened with consequences if they told their families what went on behind closed doors. Sometimes they were afraid to return to their communities, especially girls who had been violated and were now pregnant. When they did get home, boys and girls found they were inadequate at the traditional skills and tasks. They'd never had a proper chance to learn. And of course, the children suffered a loss of faith, a loss of trust, a loss of belief in their parents and the extended family. I paused for a second, giving my words a chance to sink in. Judge Sinclair said that he and the 2 other commissioners hear these stories by the hundreds, and they feel the suffering each time. The Honourable Mr. Sinclair has evidently done well in the world. May I ask what the current state of affairs is for the majority of his fellow Indians? Interesting you should say that, I replied. Another thing he mentioned was the intergenerational effect of the schools, because it's not just the survivors who were scarred. He used the phrase residual impacts in the lives of their children and even grandchildren. You must enlighten me. Well, he showed a film presentation about an Inuvialuit elder from Tuktoyaktuk. Man, from where? Tuktoyaktuk, on the Arctic Ocean. I suppose it had a colonial name in your day. Today we take it for granted that most of the communities in the far north go by their Inuit names. Anyway, until the day of the hearing, the man had never spoken about his experiences at residential school. His own wife didn't know what he'd been through. Do you recall being put on a plane one morning, flown south, and like all the children, given a number? In a sense, that's all he was, a number. For Judge Sinclair, the most powerful moment of the man's testimony came when he said, "I'm not number 142, I'm Paul Vudrach." I don't see what any of this has to do with, what was your phrase? Intergenerational effect. Paul was sexually abused in the school. Later in life, he contemplated suicide. But the point is, when he became a father, he mistreated his own children. He admitted, you see, he didn't know how to be a parent. Judge Sinclair said that when they testify, at least 80% of the survivors talk about how they went on to behave or misbehave with their own families in later life. So the shame they experienced as children gets compounded by the shame and guilt caused by their own actions. Scott sniffed. I'm surprised at how you keep on using the word survivors. Admittedly, an Indian school could be a difficult place for children, but it's not as if they've been through the trenches serving their country in the Great War. Isn't it? I said. He stared at me. No, it isn't. All right, I said, staring back. Let's think about what they went through. Imagine that instead of being raised by your loving parents, as you were, in the company of your sisters, you were hauled away by strange men when you were 6 or 5 or even 4 years old. You were terrified because you had no idea where they were taking you. The journey was long, and when you finally arrived, you were locked up inside a large, cold building. Your hair was hacked away. The clothes your mother had made for you were stripped off, and you had to put on a foreign uniform. You wore this uniform all through your childhood and adolescence. There was no alternative. There was no escape. In your early childhood, you'd lived outside much of the time. Now you could leave the school building only when the adults granted permission. You were given a number. You were known by that number. If you dared to use your own name, or if you were caught speaking a sentence in your own language, you were beaten. Spare the rod and spoil the child, your teacher said. Gradually you forgot your language. When you were sent home in the summertime, you couldn't understand your own grandparents, nor could you tell them what you were going through. Back at school, you were told day after day, year after year, that you belonged to an inferior people. You had no culture of your own. You were a savage, and your teachers were civilized. They understood God. You did not. And the God they understood was a jealous God, who meant to consign your own parents and grandparents to the fires of hell. A few of the teachers were kind, but only a few. Most of them were incompetent, and 2 or 3 were downright sadistic. The fear of them was so great, you could never entirely relax. You learned to live with constant hunger. The food was bad and there was never enough of it to fill your belly. The clothes you wore were ragged and dirty. The building where you spent most of your life was dark, ugly, infested with cockroaches, and in perpetual need of repair. At night you slept under a thin blanket in a miserable bed, with children coughing all around you and no fresh air. Over the years, a few of the children in your dormitory died, or perhaps more than a few. But nobody was ever allowed to talk about their deaths. The absolute rule was silence. Let's suppose you were one of the lucky ones. Let's suppose you somehow managed to avoid coming down with tuberculosis, or that you weren't sexually assaulted by a teacher or one of the older boys. Of course you knew this was happening to many of the other children. Everyone knew it. You lived in fear, continual fear, that one day it would happen to you. More than anything else, you were isolated. From the first day you arrived at the school, you were lonely. You were always lonely. But Mr. Scott, if you endured 10 years of this and were able to walk out the door at the end, when did you call yourself a survivor? I swallowed hard and glanced out the front window at the tree-lined street, but when I looked back, Scott was no longer there.